All right, well, welcome to today's session with our very special guest, Dr. Saskia Sassen. I'm Laura D'Antonio, an assistant teaching professor of international business at the George Washington University School of Business, and today's program is part of my Age of Globalization course. In addition to my own students, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone else who's joined us from the Elliott School, the Columbia School, and some special guests from outside the university. Before we get started, I'd like to thank my colleagues at GW-CIBER for co-sponsoring this event and for helping with the technical details. Dr. Anna Helm is the director of our GW-CIBER. Anna, could you take a minute to fill everyone in on what CIBER is and on some of the ways students can get involved?
So again, thank you, Professor D'Antonio. We really appreciate this opportunity to collaborate with you and are excited about the presentation today by Professor Sassen. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to all the students in our Age of Globalization course and others who have joined us today for the presentation on the importance of global cities. My name is Anna Helm, and I'm the faculty director of the Center for International Business Education and Research, GW-CIBER, at the George Washington University School of Business. GW-CIBER is one of 15 such centers across the United States funded by the U.S. Department of Education with a broad mandate to increase the competitiveness of U.S. firms abroad. To this effect, we support cutting-edge international business research, provide outreach programming for the business and policy communities, and design and offer innovative educational experiences for students. The cornerstone of our programming revolves around preparing students for careers in international business in order to help meet U.S. Firms' demands for competent, globally minded talent. We hope that you will seek out opportunities offered by GW-CIBER during your time at GW. Some examples of student activities are international case competitions, international trade tracks, and our very special International Business Boot Camp, a 9-week virtual summer program that allows students to delve deeply into the mechanics of the nitty-gritty of international trade and what really happens at borders. Make sure you watch out for our announcements on LinkedIn. So now we'll turn it over to Professor D'Antonio. And again, we're delighted to have Professor Sassen here. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Anna. The format of today's meeting will be a conversation, kind of a dialogue between myself, Dr. Sassen, some of my students, and one of our Masters in IB students who have prepared questions based on her work. If at any point during the session anyone else has questions they'd like to ask, please type those in the chat, which we'll be monitoring. And if we have any time at the end, we'll get to those questions, as many of those questions as we can. Students, when you're called on to speak, please turn on both your video and your microphone. It's much nicer for our guest to actually see to whom she's speaking. And when not speaking, please remain muted. So enough of the technical details. Let me introduce our guest. Saskia Sassen is the Robert S. Lind Professor of Sociology at Columbia University and a member of its Committee on Global Thought, which she chaired until 2015. She's also a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and she's Zooming with us today from London. Dr. Sassen is a student of cities, immigration, and states in the world economy, with inequality, gendering, and digitization as 3 key variables through her important work. She's authored numerous books that have been translated into 20 languages, and YouTube is replete with her many talks. Dr. Sassen has received numerous awards and honors from institutions around the world, and she frequently appears on a variety of lists of top global thinkers. It is a pleasure and truly an honor to welcome Dr. Sassen to our class today. So Saskia, just to get started, I hope you don't mind me calling that. I think
I was going to say a few words just after you.
Okay, please do.
It is so absolutely amazing. You know, I got to know your father, but you must have been a very, very young girl when,
yeah.
well, as I am, or whatever, even younger. And so it is absolutely an astounding moment in many ways. I must say, this doesn't happen often to me. You know that, because it's the father-daughter relation that sort of activates this a bit, which is quite wonderful, I must say. But so let's get going, I guess.
Okay. So, Saskia, you're famous for basically all things cities, and you started on that path with your 1991 work, in which you coined the term global cities. So to get us started, could you clarify for us your definition of global cities?
I'm sorry, I have to laugh because it is a question I get often, still now, though it was, it happened 20, 30 years ago.
No, I know. So how has that definition changed over the years? And then how does it differ from related constructs?
From, pardon?
From related constructs like international cities or world cities.
Right, right. Well, I would say that international cities are sort of part of the larger context of global cities. Notion about the global has to also probably be situated, because there was a moment in our really shared histories as people who lived in Western countries, when the international dimension took a very different forms. It was not simply the field for diplomats. It was not simply about government to government. It was also about people. It was about a new type of migrant who felt sort of enabled to cross an ocean and go to a country like North America where they didn't know anybody. So these were very particular moments, when I began to work on this. It really goes back 20, 30 years. And it's just really interesting that opening existed, because today it's more difficult. Today, some of those movements that people took are more difficult, if not impossible. So we experienced, and we were young scholars at that point, we experienced a very important moment in our history, a moment that has not repeated itself, because the doors are closing more than opening more.
You talk a lot about cities as complex but incomplete systems.
Right.
And I'd like to apply that idea to a question about cities in China. As China's pushed for economic growth, they've been building cities right and left and moving people into them, and they plan on continuing to do that. But there's a sense that these kind of bespoke cities are sort of soulless. So do you think that these new cities can capture the deep complexity that you've written about in cities?
Well, I think, it's a variable. What can I say? I'm a sociologist, and without the term variable, we would be in deep trouble. So I don't want to abuse the ease, with which we can introduce this notion of it's a variable. But let me say that cities have long been incomplete systems, and that is a crucial point in the kind of analysis that I do. Most systems are not incomplete. Most systems that we have made tend to be marked by closure. The city was a collective project, and the city from the start had the poor and the rich and this religion and that religion and the merchant and the et cetera, et cetera. So by definition, it started out as such a different mode, of organizing life, organizing economy, etc., etc., and also different from countries, because countries have, of course, they have economies, they have it all, but at the same time they are more closed, even though they have, of course, international connections and all of that. But ultimately, they are closed systems. You need authorization of one kind or another, mild kind or very, very tough kind, in order to access them. So there is an interesting capability that cities have evinced across the centuries. They are one of the oldest formations that we had. We long had cities before we had states. When the states moved in as major actors, that was a very important moment, and it changed a lot of stuff. But the cities, their condition was changed, but they continue to exist. They continue to be there. So the city, and I always think of the city as a place where we, the citizens, have our strongest standing. stronger really than with our states. With our states, it's our passports, it's our documents. With the city, it is us as active makers, interpreters, etc.
Well, let me kind of build off of what you just said. So if we are the cities, as you say, we're deeply embedded in the cities, and yet you've written in your work about the privatization of ownership of the cities. And
Yes.
so how does that interact if we're the cities, but we're being pushed out by these corporate actors?
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I have written quite a bit about it. That begins to signal, and this is especially in major cities, because a lot of the smaller cities are not affected by this. But there is a real, and I have tracked these financial actors, and we have written about that. There is a kind of very powerful financial firms that up till now never were interested in the city as such, the city as something that they could add to all the other elements they have in order to make a lot of money. And now, some of these major actors who never cared, they're really financial firms, who never cared about cities, who were never interested in cities, guess what? They are beginning to buy up pieces of cities, including lower income areas. So it tells you something that I would interpret, we can interpret it in many different ways, but I would interpret it as we have entered a kind of new epoch. The change is partial, but the change is significant. And it has to do with the capacity of very powerful economic actors in the rich countries. I don't know what's happening in the poor countries, but the poor countries also have rich actors. So it may well be happening there as well. And it is this notion of buying up urban land. Well, how do you buy urban land? It comes in the shape of buildings. And so they are buying up buildings. This is not necessarily about the buildings. It's not the value of the building that is in play. The value that is in play is of a different kind. And here comes an intermediation that is a bit complicated, but this is something that I've been working on now for several years. And that is that what we see as a building, what we see as structures, physical structures, via certain types of algorithms, mathematical algorithms, actually is transformed in a field of assets. The building doesn't exist anymore. It's assets, it becomes assets. And that is what is of interest. And the buying of buildings is not necessarily about the building per se, where you're going to aim at filling it up with people. Hell no. A fancy building that is empty can actually be more desirable than one that is occupied. Why? Because it is not about what we understand as home living, buying something where you're going to live in. It is about how do we construct that financial condition, those buildings, into a financial instrument that you can buy, sell on the markets, many times in a day. The aim of these sort of, they're very distinguished, very rich firms with extraordinarily intelligent people. This is the history of algorithmic math. These are brilliant minds which are being used, to make everything more extractive. So you can buy and sell it in seconds or in a day. And that is what's happening with some of the buildings. So when you see a luxury building that is empty, the immediate response for your average human, what is happening in what looks like a building, what is really in play? And what is in play is much more than a building or housing. That is still also present in most cities. A house is a house and a building is about building. But there are these particular sites like London, New York, and a few others, where we have all of that, the familiar, and then we have this new format. And this new format is what I'm talking about and what concerns me in my current research.
So now how, so with the pandemic happening, and we're having more and more people working from home, and there's a proliferation of empty buildings. So buildings are becoming suddenly more empty. So what do you think is going to happen? Will those empty, post-pandemic empty buildings continue to be converted into financial instruments? And then what's that going to do to the neighborhoods that the, you know, what happens with all those empty buildings? You have an empty city.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's a very particular kind of building that is functioning in this advanced new way, we might say, that is intermediated by algorithmic mathematics and brilliant minds who are enabling that transformation. You know, we cannot see it with our eyes. This is very advanced stuff, actually, the way they do that. But let's remember that most cities and most buildings in most cities are just what they used to be. You know, they are not all subjected to this treatment. It is in cities that contain a lot of wealth, you see this. Now, in other words, the Londons, the New Yorks, the Paris, that kind of city. Now, the question for me, and I do not have an answer yet, is, well, what if this system has worked so well, this way of financializing a building, that, in other words, that it's an asset that you can buy, sell several times in a day, if it's a good day, and you make money on every sale, you know, that kind of a thing. In other words, not house, but something else, even though it is about a house. So I think that this is a very rarefied zone. It involves very luxury cities, you know, a certain type of a buyer, a certain type of speculator. But, you know, in most of the world, including in most of the United States, housing is actually the real thing that we call housing, which is actually very reassuring, because, and by the way, what I described is also something that has its limits. It's not an endless thing that's just going to grab. No, everything is a kind of curve. And so a lot of buildings in a city, most of the buildings will not be of interest. It's more really the very fancy buildings that can begin to function in a way that is a bit different. And I think it started partly because some of those fancy buildings are so expensive, and many of them came out when the crises began, that they had to find another way of using them. And out of that comes this, I mean, you know, many of these firms, these financial firms, they have brilliant people doing work for them. You know, they are like the ultimate minds that are working. And you know, it's sort of sad that they're working at that, but there they are. And so they have invented modalities that we could just never have imagined that this could happen. We cannot see these transformations with our eyes. That is one way of putting it. It is very abstract stuff. And I you know, you can see that I don't know if you can see it, but I'm sort of smiling at it, because it is really extreme. It is like, if it were toys, you would say, wow, that is some toy that they developed there. But they're not toys, you know. That's the right.
So you mentioned a few comments ago, you talked a little bit about the relationship between the city and the nation state. So how do you view a current sort of power situation between the city and the nation state? Do you think that we're going to see a reemergence of city-states in some way as cities form their own networks of governance around the globe?
Well, I'm very glad you picked up on that, because this is just something that I'm beginning to put out there. But I think there is something that we need to capture. And for that, we need a different approach. And that is what this project for me is about. And that has to do with, it has to do in part with, as I already said, with these amazing innovations that we have, and the fact that very brilliant minds are adding to these innovations. So it becomes also not a game, but a kind of a speculative, exciting innovation to play with, to try out. I really don't know how far it will go, but it has already moved some, and it clearly becomes a source for a way of extracting value to the advantage of certain parties and the disadvantage, I would say, to the average condition in a city, to the leadership of cities. You know, they lose ground. They lose track of what are the mechanisms in play through which these extraordinary acquisitions are happening, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something that will take quite a bit of research and of, you know, many different types of scholars, really, to fully understand this transformation that has happened. It doesn't have a name. You know, it just doesn't have a name. We have to find a name for it too. That always helps. But right now, because I've tried to find out, does this that I'm describing, this mode of capturing materialities that you then transform in something that is algorithmic mathematics, and hence you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell many times in a day. That kind of, I mean, you know, do we have a name for that? I'm sure that in the business there is a name, but it's not a name in the public. The public simply stops thinking about what could that be. It's just too complicated, you know. And I believe that it is not that complicated. It's actually pretty straightforward, but it is so sort of covered up by all kinds of other elements that we have to just penetrate that. But once you've penetrated that, it's not that difficult to understand what's happening, you know. And that to me is also important, that the average, I always make arguments about how the average citizen in a city should be enabled to understand what are the major vectors in play. Not everything that is in play. I mean, nobody has, you know, that kind of time, etc. But what are the major vectors that are actually transforming the nature of the economy? I do talk a lot, so you have to stop me, huh?
Okay. All right. Well, let me jump in here because we do have one of our masters in international business students, Jason Cassidy, is very interested in your work and has read quite a bit of it. So I'm going to turn the program over to him. Jason, if you want to turn on your video and unmute your microphone. And he's going to ask you a couple of questions about global cities. So Jason, you are on.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you for taking the time out of your day. So absolutely. So I was going to begin with a couple of fundamental questions that you've already touched upon. Now, if you would like to focus on some of the more recent concepts that you've been developing, I can switch.
Yeah.
But to
begin, no. Let's hear what you want to say. Let's hear it.
All right. Okay. So you write that in global cities, operational spaces emerge to support this rapidly expanding role of intermediaries whose work is so specialized in managing aspects of a global firm's operations that it has to be outsourced. Can you elaborate on how spaces for intermediation within global cities can allow global corporate actors to gain access to national economies?
I mean, I see that potentially as a negative if it is the big global actors or the big city actors that gain the access to the commons. The commons should be for the commons. And my concern is that because, you know, all materialities, I mean, one issue in play that is so difficult to actually understand is that it seems that something material can today function as two elements. One element, yes, the material. The other element is an abstract version of that material that you can then deploy and use in many, many different ways. So now mind you, these are very rarefied conditions. I said that already. So most of the people are not quite aware of this, nor do they really need to be aware, though I think it would be good for them to be aware, because the question really is, how much farther can this type of development go? You know, at what time does the grabbing really take off? And so I don't know, for instance, has the grabbing sort of reached its limit because the other properties are of no interest? By the grabbing, I meant the grabbing of big buildings, grand buildings that you then make function in two ways. I repeat myself a bit. One function is as a housing option or an office option, whatever, a big, and there is a lot of that. And the other one as something that, as an empty building, is fine, okay. Because by algorithmic math, you transform it in a set of assets. It's an asset. And yeah, am I getting at some of what you were asking or not really?
Absolutely, and I wanted to establish some groundwork, but to speak to directly what you're speaking about here, related to constructing buildings into financial instruments, I'm particularly interested in the ability that developers have related to value capture in residential areas, in gentrifying, for example, where part of the speculative housing market includes developers creating or manipulating community narratives to manufacture market value. And there's some
to manufacture, pardon, what did you say? To manufacture what?
Market value.
Oh, market value. Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. That, the question of how, because, okay, let me backtrack. One could say, most of what has value has probably been already grabbed by those who had the instruments, the means, etc., to pay for it. So one question, you just made me think about this. This is not something I had thought about before, but your question actually invites me to think that. And that is, I just wonder, as you were speaking, whether what we are actually witnessing is yet another mode, that is a bit different from the straightforward financializing of stuff, another combination of elements. Because one thing that is clear in some of these, the way some of these firms function, is that they are innovative. One wishes they were innovating for the general good. They don't necessarily for their good, most of them at least. But at the same time, it would be very interesting, I think, to see how far they can operate with their interests, like including what you just described. So rather than something that benefits the middle classes, or the modest neighborhoods, etc., that they can now also capture that. That, of course, would be the most negative version of that. I'm not sure if I am fully answered. If there's something that I'm not answering in your question, then let me know.
Your answer is very interesting, especially how you're looping part of what I was saying into the greater context of your research. Yeah. The only element that I wanted to directly ask about was this idea of narrativizing value, creating community narratives that have value in them, such as housing, capitalizing on historically Black neighborhoods and the value of culture that's in the sort of narrative airspace of a place.
So are you getting at something that has to do with the possibility that if you begin to circulate narratives that raise the value of even very, not high quality towers, for instance, that might be part of what is happening, and hence makes it again more extracting even of buildings that are meant for, say, lower middle class people. I don't like that lower in there, but you know what I mean, not the rich middle classes, but the more modest middle classes. Is that part of what you're trying to get at, or am I missing something?
Absolutely. Go ahead, please. Oh, perfect. This idea of local community narratives being capitalized and used within a sort of market of narrative exchange and elevating that narrative to a place of importance in the global international, the speculative real estate market.
Yes, exactly. That it becomes part of the money apparatus. Money is not even the proper word at this point, but everybody understands that term, money. Yes, that's very well put, and I agree that there is, and you know, the other aspect then, and then this becomes a question to you all, and that is no form of power. And I mean by form, I mean could be lower level things like some of the lower, more modest buildings that are involved, but all kinds of things like that last forever. You know, the curve is, for me, the curve is always there. I always check, is there something that can exit the curve? You would think that, you know, we all need water, we all need certain types of food, we all need that. There is no curve there of the valuation, right? Because it is what it is, what it is. But no, we now have all these new elements that allow for quite a differentiation of even the most basic things, you know, that we think of as cheap, everyday, whatever. And that is also, you know, we really, I mean, one thing is the price question, you know, that's always been there. But when you financialize certain simple commodities, but of which there are many, that you then have entered a new zone. You have actually transformed those simple commodities into something that no longer presents itself as a simple commodity, but presents itself as an asset. You know, assets is a very is a very ambiguous term, many types of assets. And that is sort of, you know, what I'm getting at and what I critique, because it is also a way of hiding a grabbing operation, hiding what is ultimately a grabbing operation. You know, and I don't know, have any of you seen this film that is called Push? I think it starts with a kind of a, you know, an A, whatever, push, at push or something like that. It just documents in a very simple way. It doesn't get into the complexities of this or that. What is happening when top level financial firms, they track one of the top, if not the top, financial firm, and how they buy up buildings for low income people and then invite those people to leave in the spirit of, we will upgrade your housing. And some of them then are in fact allowed to come back, but not always. And so the question there is, and these are financial firm, one of the top, the richest at this point, financial firm. And of course, what happens is not just that, okay, they fix it. Yeah, they do fix it. But also that it sort of enters, because it's fixed, another operational space where it can actually make money just off the buildings, not whatever the tenants can pay. You know, those are pretty, they sound very simple, but those are pretty elaborate options that the financial system has created for its own use in an extraordinarily effective way. And most residents in those buildings just think that it is whatever the manager of the building or the owner of the building, etc. But there really is another level in play. And that's not visible to the eye, you know, of the residents. I'm talking too much.
Okay, I'm gonna thank you, Jason, for your contribution there. So I'd like to
Thank you very much.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk for a few moments about smart cities, because we've talked about smart cities in class and students find smart cities fairly interesting. Yeah. So thinking about smart cities and thinking about the city, so COVID-19 has exposed some vulnerabilities in the urban system. And the question about smart cities is, can smart city technology or the idea of smart cities be used to reduce some of those vulnerabilities that we've seen caused by the pandemic. So what are your thoughts on smart cities?
You know, that is still, I would say, we don't have the full info. I think that the concept of the smart city is a bit ambiguous, and it can cover a very, very broad spectrum. So at one end, very positives, and at the other end, not so positives. But the truth of the matter is that this combination of different forms of knowledge that is involved in the question of the smart city, and also when I talked about the financializing of buildings, that sort of a mix that many people still cannot wrap their brains around, because it's just it's so invisible. You can't see it. There is not a lot of description often about it, etc. But the question that you raise brings it a bit more, to ground, to a kind of material moment that can see. I am not sure where that will go. What comes next, to tell you the truth. I just, the smart city is I think it's a growing condition, even when it's not called that. Number two, I think a lot of smart city elements should probably not be called, then have the whole city be called smart city. It's this notion of the fullness of a city being smart, which is not quite correct, because a city has so many unpredictables. You can't fully control it, you can't fully design it. If you're fully designing it, you're talking about something else. You're talking about maybe a more private space, and those are growing. There is no doubt about that. And so I would like to sort of make a difference between city and then some other name that can include city, but it is not simply the city for those other conditions. I don't know what others think. I would love to hear what other people think.
Well, one of my students, and just kind of in the interest of time, I'll just read you his question. One of my students asked the question of, with the number of cities that are trying to be smart cities, how can personal data and privacy be protected in the smart city model? I mean, there's lots of benefits to smart cities, but there's this huge downside to smart cities.
Yeah, look, there are two elements in play here. One is what you just said, that the smart city is also an extraordinary instrument. For even if you have big actors who are not interested in getting involved with that part, and they say, I'm not interested in what are the incomes of these people, what they do with it, but inevitably the data are there. That's the issue. The issue is that it is sort of put on a sort of platter. It's not a platter open to everybody, but it is a platter sort of, that is open. And so quite a few people can benefit enormously of that. One question that I have is, how far can that go? Because as far as it has gone now, I can imagine that, we can find a modus vivendi, we can find the limits of that mode, we can be reassured, in other words, by a few elements, that tell you, well, it's going to go only so far. And the smart city has only gone so far. I mean, there is Songdo, the most elaborate final product of the smart city, which is a bit of a certain kind of zone, though it is growing now up, it's becoming more like a city. And then there are in a few other places in the world, you have this smart city conglomerate, including in Barcelona, you have, in many European cities, much more so than American cities, you have a bit of that just incrustated, if you want, in most cities. That's quite interesting. The Europeans are generally, as a people, I don't mean as the specialists or that, I mean as a people, far more engaged by the technical aspect than Americans are. Americans are not particularly interested in the technical. They are interested in how much it costs, which is a very reasonable way to be interested. But it is quite amazing how they are not very interested in the technology, really, how that is involved. involved. I think they just take it for granted, etc. But so I don't know how far that will go. But certainly it will depend also of the governance question. And there, when you look at Canada, you know, how they have handled smart city, it's really more admirable, let's say, than how some other countries have done that. So there are countries that will probably stand out. China, for instance, is already standing out with everything that is advanced tech. Why? Because it's the national government that wants that sets it up, and that basically also can control it. But, you know, it's not like they're wasting their time trying to find out everything that people are doing. That isn't, some people think that, but that's not necessarily the case either, I would say. But they just have, I mean, when you go to China, the big cities, they just look so much more advanced and ready for the next epoch than the big cities in the United States.
So is that going to shift? Are cities going to shift in terms of competitiveness in the network of global cities? Because of what you just said, they seem so much more prepared.
Yeah, probably there will be some of that. But in the end, the city is also of value to, say, investors who want to then transform it. As I was saying, it ceases to be the city. It's just assets that you can build on. But the city has so much of that still. Maybe this is not forever. That I think that a good part of the cities will actually also benefit a bit from that. It's not like they will be displaced simply by new technologies. It's rather, I would argue, that the new technologies will try to also enter the domain of cities. And that's a different mode of thinking about it, you know. So the cities are incorporated in some of the new technical systems. And that's different. That's a new mode, because it used to be the other way, that the city incorporates, you know, some things that it wants, etc. But that in the long run, given the citizenry that is involved, that could actually become a positive. You know, so it's not just the entrepreneurs, it's the people also. And so in that sense, and one hopes that a majority of people, it will never be all, is a bit engaged also by the technological aspects. You know, many people still just simply reject the whole technological thing. They just don't want to hear about it. And I think they don't, you know, none of us is a super expert. It's impossible. The field is now enormous. But, you know, entering that a bit and just getting some sense, so that is how they're doing it now. So, you know, just as a curiosity rather than a knowledge function. I think that should be happening much more in a country like the US. And it's happening a lot in Europe, you know, and it's happening in Canada to a bigger extent than in the United States. I don't know why the United States still has so many conditions that are really make you think of poor country rather than the country that it is. You know,
Absolutely. We've been talking about our very own fragile state right here at home and how that feels. But another vulnerability of cities nationwide, not just in the United States, are their vulnerability to climate change. And you have written some about how cities both contribute to the problem and potentially to the solutions of climate change. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the big issue, of course, the negative is we have built, I mean, whole jungles of cement. And that's not a positive when you're thinking of the environment. There are better ways of handling it. So the question is, do we have good examples of cities that are cities? In other words, there's a lot of materiality involved. There is a lot of covering up what used to be green space with cement, you know, is one simple way of putting it. We are not going to be able to fully escape that. There is now, yes, there are extraordinary advances, and the Japanese are really among the top here, to how to use other materials. than cement, etc. Or to use a cement that is a transformed cement, because these are quite destructive materials. We are now beginning to really notice the amount of land that our modernity, because it really is across the world, our modernity has destroyed vast amounts of land and vast water bodies. So there is quite an effort going on in many, many different cities in many different ways of how can we, yes, have buildings which will be slightly destructive of some natural conditions, etc., but buildings that at least work, once they exist, that they work with how nature functions. And here I think the Europeans, the Japanese, to some extent, well, Seoul certainly, to some extent in the Emirates, because they're building new buildings and they have so much money and they want to show off how smart they are. And so they are beginning to use very fancy stuff also, but in the good sense of fancy, but fancy materials. But, there is no way that with us on this planet, that we're not going to have destruction, of land. Even if we use the best technologies, we're going to have to destroy some land to put the building on. That fine, technologically designed and sort of, let's say, charitable to land and to air. So we're stuck. We really are. Since with the moment that we appeared on this planet, it began, and it can get better, because we really reached the point where absolute abuse. We are now more serious about it, and that already counts, I think, for something.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm hoping that cities can be part of the solution, and we can move more towards sustainability. And I'm jumping around topics a little bit because we're going to run short on time. But I did want to touch on your thinking and work that you've done on migration. And my question would be, so you are, of course, a migrant yourself, having moved from Netherlands to Buenos Aires to Rome to the US, which we kind of helped with, to London. And your early work focused on this mobility of labor and capital. So, I'm guilty, I admit this, of putting migrants move for a better life on a slide about kind of the push and pull of migration. So I admit that. But you suggest that migrants face a much more complex set of conditions than simply moving from a poor place to a rich place for a better life. So could you explain some of your thinking about migration and the role of the migrant in kind of this networked global system?
Well, that's a very interesting question you ask. I mean, I think that there are multiple types of migrations. We know that, right? We know that. So the refugees, they also were migrants, and they looked for refuge. And they found it in diverse countries. A lot went to France, a lot went to the Americas, etc. So migration comes in many different formats. Second point, the poor. The poor who leave their poor countries or their oppressive countries, or the fact that their housing was taken away by the opposite, whatever, bandits or regimes, whatever. We have such an amount of negative moves in play that it is really, to me, what has happened with some of the migration flows, it's really a very, very sad, very dramatic story. I mean, it really is becoming more and more serious because also we are running out of space. Coming back to some of the points we raised earlier, the fact that there is more and more grabbing of land by very powerful actors, building on sites where before you might have had a modest housing situation, now you build for the rich because they are more rich. So we are confronting a very serious problem. And add to that climate, like just recently there were all these big storms, etc., that killed a lot of people who were in process of migrating in certain parts of the world. So I ask myself the question very often, what is next? And I see a very problematic situation. I am afraid that if we don't do some radical, but really radical expansions of spaces that can absorb people in a reasonable way, moreover, in a way that they can have a reasonable living, not be rich, but I'm not talking about that, but have food, have space, have clean water, clean air. We are going to see more and more the shrinking of our numbers. They are not yet, we humans, I'm talking about we humans. But I don't see how we can sustain what is happening now. I also think that a lot of people are dying who are never recorded as dying. And India, for me, is exhibit number one. India, which is full of brilliant and super rich people, many rich, is to me one of the most objectionable countries, I confess. People have already heard me say that. This is not the first time I say that, because they have such brilliant intelligence, such minds, so much wealth, but especially the intelligence that they have. I do not understand how they could not deploy more of that to enable the massive amount of people who are simply handled brutally. They might as well be cattle the way they treat them. Well, cattle gets treated better, actually. So that is like a hot spot. For me, the way India is handling things is a far more significant hotspot than how, say, the Americans are doing stuff or how the Chinese are doing stuff. Nobody's perfect in this world. But I just want to mention that because that's rarely mentioned. People often think of the most powerful countries as the most problematic countries. I mean, they're all a bit problematic, no doubt, but they're not necessarily the worst. Say the Europeans are really far more reasonable with Mother Nature than we are in the United States. We in the United States are far richer in some way than the Europeans. Europeans are very rich too, but they have managed extraordinarily well, really a distributed kind of an economy that distributes its wealth in a way that the United States does not. I should stop talking because I realize, but I'm hoping that I'm addressing your I'm hoping that I'm addressing your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So just as our sort of a final question here, again, since we started a little bit late. So we have people joining us today, both from the business school, our Elliott School for International Affairs, our sociology department, and the School of Arts and Sciences. So you've attracted an interdisciplinary audience, which is great. And you yourself are interdisciplinary. So could you talk just a little bit for our students about your interdisciplinary journey? And I think that being interdisciplinary is both attractive to students, but a little bit frightening because it doesn't give you a label and a clear pathway, yet it might be more interesting. So maybe you can talk to our students a little bit about what it's like to be an interdisciplinary person.
Yeah, no, that I like that a lot. Well, first, you might just drop the term interdisciplinary because then, ooh. But what about, instead of, what we have tended to do in the West is to build these knowledge silos. Start out as thick zones where a lot of research is necessary, and then wind up thinner and thinner and thinner till up the top it's like a bit of a marginal little thingy that we might just add. Instead of just going all the way up, how about going transversal? And go transversal in an elementary way, not to try to understand the next door knowledge silo, so to speak, but just to extract elements from their knowledge that you can bring in to your bundle of, propositions and discoveries or whatever, so that you begin to sort of work a bit transversally. And that is how it went for me. I wasn't there making a new whatever. No, I needed elements of knowledge that were in other types of knowledge than the type of knowledge that the social conditions of things. And that is, you can give that a try. And I think these knowledge silos are getting just a bit tired, at the top. It's like the elements are often now this minor little addition. Ooh, okay, we always will have some people doing that, but we need more people now who really can go a bit transversal and starting at the bottom. You know, how does one thing like the climate change issue is an element that also invites that? You know, there are a variety of elements. So that is, I don't want to give you another lecture here, but that is one way of thinking about it, that you try to see, okay, besides this element that I know so much about, what is there outside this element that somehow could be part of my little tower of knowledge, you know, that it could add. I think we're getting there slowly, but I told you my story, right? And just for those, I just mentioned again, my first book, which eventually became a very much regarded book, was rejected by 12 publishers. They said, this is great stuff, but where does it fit? Because I didn't fit in a given disciplinary, subdisciplinary element. That's the pathetic part, subdisciplinary. Well, in the end, the book came out with a good press, Cambridge University Press, and it became a very significant book. So, but that taught me something. Rejected, you know, by 12, you know what that is? That took 2 years of rejections. That was 2 years of rejection. And so, but now we're in that period where going transversal is actually interesting, and it takes a bit of courage, and hence those who do are often actually respected, because it's not seen as a deviation, it's seen as a, wow, okay, you know, this is, and that is a change, I think.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that our academic system doesn't support that particularly as well as it should. In my opinion, we're a little bit guilty of perpetuating the silos, and I really commend you having sociology and finance and figuring out a way to kind of marry those two, where we, especially at the undergraduate level, seem to have much more difficulty reaching out to our other schools.
Yeah, well, it depends also on the universities, but I think there is in general, there is a bit of movement going in that direction. I would say that it's not an announced change, but there is change. You know the difference, right?
Yeah.
And more and more of the younger generation who are the field that they are interested in is a bit broader than to be typical. I mean, you know, we cannot exaggerate too much the differences and all of that. I mean, it's difficult, you know. To some extent, there always have been people who were a bit transversal, you know, in the discipline. Sociology lends itself a bit more than other kinds of disciplines, at least at some other kinds of disciplines, to sort of, you know, crossing the borders. But I remember that when I first started here, because I was trained a bit in France, and so it was a different way of thinking, actually, that when I came to the United States, I was a bit amazed at what we were not meant to do or to touch. You know, like no, you can't go there. What the hell? What do you mean I can go there? And of course, as I said, my first book got rejected by 12 publishers, not because the editors didn't like it, but the readers who were the critics, you know how that goes. They said, no. So now it amuses me. It was very amusing then.
At the time, it sounds pretty painful. Okay, so let me just check the chat. Do any of my students have any questions? I'm sorry I didn't let you ask your questions yourself. It was just in the interest of time because we got started a little bit late. So was there anybody else who wanted to ask a question? Otherwise, we're past our 2 o'clock time, and I don't want to take up too much of Saskia's day. All right, well, with that,
Yes.
I'd just like to tell you what a wonderful experience it's been, both for me and for our students, to be able to engage with you. Many of them and so appreciated your work and found it interesting, had questions. And so that was just terrific to see how your work really energized them in such a positive way.
That is nice.
So it's been terrific. And I'd also like to again thank GW-CIBER for helping me with the logistics, and all of the rest of you being such an attentive audience. So